little bit about this. I'll give a little background on this question before I ask it. William Nordhaus was brought up as the latest winner of the Nobel Prize in economics. He actually won it with Paul Romer as well. He started working on a model that tried to explain the impacts of climate change on the global economy back in the 1980s. And he's still working on it today, and he's still refining it all the time. And the model's publicly available. And what he has gotten over the last 20 or 30 years that he's been working on it is feedback from climate scientists, because he needs to accurately depict the climate in an economic model. So the Nobel Prize was given in economics to Nordhaus, but he would be the first to admit that much of that prize should go also to the scientists who helped him codify and build a model of climate change with all the impacts of albedo and feedback and things like that. So anyways, that leads me to the first question, and I'll start just because you were the first speaker. What has been the role of interdisciplinary knowledge and perspectives in your field and in your work in particular?
Yeah, well, I hit the interdisciplinary theme fairly hard in my talk. At least I hope that came through. I work in the Institute for Environmental Studies at University of Wisconsin, which is from its inception in 1970 was very much based on interdisciplinary knowledge. And my own background is meteorology, and that's how I got interested in climate. But it quickly became apparent, particularly if you're talking about climate change, that you need to get out of that disciplinary lens by itself. It's important to maintain the roots of the knowledge, but you cannot tackle any problem as big as climate change with only one discipline. And so it was very interesting, and it's been very rewarding to work with lots of different people from different areas. Over the time that I've been in this business, this career, I've worked with all sorts of different backgrounds, including economists from time to time, engineers, public health experts, all sorts of different people, and it's been great. And I think that part of it is just if you have an inherent curiosity in other fields beyond your own, it helps. But also I think what really drives it is the question you're working on. If you realize, well, as much as I'm interested in what I've been trained in, I simply cannot deal with, I can't tackle this problem by myself or with my own colleagues. And I think that gives a lot of motivation toward more interdisciplinary work and the motivation to actually broaden oneself.
So Rebecca, how often do you work with, obviously I guess you were, your brother cajoled you to read that report, but how much have you actually interacted with scientists, or do you interact with artists, for example? Do you interact with authors of fiction in any way?
Oh, you're really pushing my boundaries here, Eric. I thought I was pretty interdisciplinary when I was talking to psychologists and political scientists. So I read a lot of the apocalyptic fiction. Okay. I think it's fascinating. I interact a bunch with scientists. Harvard has the Harvard University Center for the Environment, and we run regular seminar series and so on. I can't tell you that in my own work there's a lot of direct transfer of knowledge. It's more of regularly going back to the research to remind oneself what the timeframes are like, the sheer magnitude of what's likely to happen. I'm always amazed, Steve, and Steve, I see you give that presentation and you're so calm. And I'm thinking, But I actually think that's really important, is it's really important to be reminded what the research says, why this is urgent, because you can get caught up in, I have papers to write and classes to teach, and so that's my primary connection. But yeah, I hang out with a bunch of climate scientists, and they're all terrifying people.
But could I jump in for 1 second and continue along this sort of vein of thought? I'm curious, in the case of the three speakers, what your background was like in order for you to be able to acknowledge the value of working across disciplines or with people from different disciplines, and also how did you become so good at developing a narrative around what it is you do?
So I'm happy to start because I'm actually quite unusual as an economist in working quite aggressively interdisciplinary. For me, it really was important. I spent 2 years working for McKinsey before I did my graduate degree, because I started doing a graduate degree in economics at Harvard, and I met the idea that firms were instantaneously optimizing point sources. And if you've been working for McKinsey in Northern England, you knew that firms were not instantaneously optimizing point sources. And so having some experience, maybe I shouldn't be saying that in this event, but having some experience in the real world was super important in giving me a sense of how kind of extremely kind of mixed up the whole world was. I'd be really curious to hear from our artist on this, because as, you know, I loved your sort of, well, you know, you're really an artist, but you clearly, I mean, how did that happen that you got so engaged in so many different ways of looking at the world?
It's because my father is a dentist. I think a lot of it started happening. I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to say. I'm just thinking about, like, when I was an undergrad, I was really interested in post-pop artwork that was, you know, commentaries on consumerism, and I've always been really, like, fascinated by Taylorism in manufacturing and production, and I love looking at assembly lines. You know, very strange machines and systems, and, you know, the garden is the system. And some of the research that I'm doing now is actually a much more deeper investigation of ecosystems, versus like that where the plant is just kind of more on a symbolic level. Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think, as you said, curiosity, and most of my artist friends are also very curious too. And, you know, and at Buffalo we have a biological arts center now, where the director is a well-established biological artist, and, you know, working with DNA and, you know, human sweat and all kinds of things. So it's almost like, you know, we tend to be in this world where we're just really used to, all of us, very kind of academic, scholarly, knowledgeable about all these other disciplines, and then, you know, just wanting, I think it's just really wanting to make it accessible to broader audiences, because I feel like a lot of this information really does become really siloed. And even working with the design students in these different nonprofits, you know, what are they doing? You know, they're generating reports. You know, who really wants to look at these reports? You know, not that many people. And if part of it is really to generate public awareness, right, you have to, you know, also engage the spectacle and make things a little bit more tantalizing and seductive. So.
And I'm not sure if there was a single experience for me, but growing up, I was always interested in politics. My parents were, you know, interested in politics, and I always thought of those being very separate from my scientific interests, but clearly nowadays that's not the case. And you know, it was less so in the 90s when I was in graduate school. I think there was a more of a bipartisan acceptance of climate change. Clearly that's diverged in recent years, and so that, at least for me, has pushed things beyond science. I mean, you simply cannot study climate as a scientist without acknowledging the elephant in the room. I mean, the US is the only country in the world now that's not part of the Paris Agreement. And so that is something that is just sort of faces you front and center all the time. There's days when I really wish that I could separate the politics out of this and just focus on the meteorology and, oh, isn't it interesting, the circulation pattern might change, this and that. But if you want to make a difference, I mean, if you want to make it relevant for the world, you have to go beyond, at least into politics, as Rebecca so well explained, and in economics and so on. And so I think that, at least for me, is largely the motivation, that you just, in order to make this relevant, you have to go beyond a single discipline.
Well, that leads really nicely into the question that I was tasked with asking about the future, because you talked a little bit, and I'm going to work backwards this way. You mentioned the interest in going from the garden to the ecosystem, and please tell us where you're going. Like, how are you going to bring ecosystem into your future work, or what are your plans for the next?
For here at Bowdoin, or?
I'm going to let you just, yeah, you can have Bowdoin, or you can have the world.
That means I can have the world, it means I can have voting. Well, what I think from starting, working with plants and living organisms, and I think being surrounded by so many biological artists that are, working in labs, that I started working with mycelia, mushroom fungi. I started working with Physarum, polycephalin, slime molds. Those are very easy medium to work with. And one thing that, I don't know if I mentioned, but probably is obvious, is most of my work I consider visualizations, right? And working with data, and data tells a story. It's a different kind of storytelling, and I kind of see my work as these sort of expanded visualizations. And so I was interested, always in what the role of technology is in, let's say we're looking at changing models of finance, right, with crowdfunding and micro-lending. But you're looking at these different kinds of networks, right? And so mycelium is a network, right? And we can look at the wood wide web, right? Or the slime mold and the way that it's sort of mapping and creating different networks. So that, what I'm really interested in is a lot of this biological market theory I find kind of fascinating. And are there ways to kind of rethink some of these environmental problems by, sort of almost like reversing, and to some extent it's anthropomorphizing, like what if you put non-human actors in the driver's seat of, and within the context of human-centric models of finance and governance, and looking, within the context of resilience. So I've actually been working on, and everything I do, although the garden's kind of serious, most of my other work is very whimsical and playful, with like avatars, and I dress up in wigs and tinfoil hats and do all those kinds of things. But how could we look at Puerto Rico's reconstruction and this infrastructure that's been destroyed, not just from the hurricane, but from decades, and rethink it through the networking of, the non-human. And so I have some kind of crazy thing with lemon batteries and soil energy and red mold fungus and things like that.
She's right down
right, which will be
downstairs from me,
right.
so I'm very
I'll be
excited
molding
to
some
see where
bread
this is going to
and-
show
yeah,
up in my
yeah,
office. Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah.
I'm very excited. And I love the term that you use, the non-human actors in the driver's seat, and I'm going to take that over to Rebecca to see what that could mean in terms of how could that change the way that you're viewing business?
So as you probably know, that's a really hot question at
Yes.
the moment. Yeah.
Nice segue.
Yeah. So as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, for nearly 100 years, economics has been dominated by a view of the human as predominantly selfish and individualistic, which when I first started my PhD in economics, I thought was a model that no one took seriously. It took about 15 years to realize, no, they really believed it. Seriously, it's what is increasingly clear from modern psychological research, and damned obvious if you look at society or history, is that humans are also fundamentally groupish and in many ways altruistic in interesting ways. And that our economic system at the moment absolutely puts into primacy the individual and the selfish. What's weird about the study of firms, of course, is a firm is in many ways a cooperative group in which it's necessary to submit a part of yourself. And in fact, if you're purely selfish and purely all about yourself in a firm, except in some firms, you're not going to do very well. And so one of the interesting questions is, can we rethink economics and rethink firms, hence my interest in purpose, as a much kind of broader, more collaborative thing. We think that economics is all about competition, but it's also all about cooperation. I mean, firms are all about cooperation, supply chains are all about cooperation. Now, I'm big on competition. I'm not like, let's sing Kumbaya and just dance around the trees. I'm an economist after all. But if we could learn to hold these in a better balance, I think that would be really helpful as we move forward.
Which is just an actually beautiful segue into talking about community climate models. Because you can't do it alone, right? Businesses can't do it alone, and neither can climate models. You know, and climate modelers can't do it by themselves because they're so complicated and you can't know everything. And so, Stephen, what do you see as the future, and what are the emerging trends in climate models in terms of bringing us scientists together as a community and allowing them to bring in other interests besides not just the scientists, but other players as well?
Yeah, I suppose the development of climate modeling really is kind of a microcosm for this discussion. So back in the early days, they were called general circulation models, and they were largely fluid dynamics representations of the atmosphere by themselves or by the ocean alone. And then a big deal in the 60s was merging them and coupling them, and then you discovered other interesting phenomena about how these two media interact. And then people realize, well, really, there's a little bit more out there than just the ocean and the atmosphere. You know, we have land, we have all sorts of different processes. And so then other aspects, ice was put in and vegetation was put in. And it's really evolved, this community Earth system model. I've been involved in it for a good 20 years now. And I remember in the early days, you pretty much knew everybody in the room, either personally or by face. But it quickly changed about the turn of the century. And as more and more different components came into it, things got more and more complicated. The models became increasingly complex to the point where nobody completely understands them, no single person. And so you get these working groups of different people, of experts in different topics, subtopics, having to work together. And it's not easy. And the more complicated the models become, potentially the more powerful they are, but also the harder they are to diagnose and understand. And a newer trend is integrated assessment modeling that goes beyond traditional physical or biological chemical modeling and brings in economic activity. And that is really difficult, trying to figure out exactly how a climate change might impact the behavior of a certain people or how carbon emissions might be impacted. We have enough trouble understanding the gyrations of the stock market from day to day, like yesterday's drop. And so, but it really is necessary. I mean, what Rebecca was saying about the importance of economics in terms of climate change, these sorts of increasingly complex models with integrated assessment are the way of the future. They're not easy, but the CESM effort, Community Earth System Model Community, is part of that, and I think that is the way to go, and it's attracting more and more scientists to the mix, and I think that eventually it'll really pay off.
This is what happens when you ask an artist to come up and do this. I'm going to go a little bit off script.
Okay.
And I'm interested in having each one of you guys try, and this is going to get at a little bit of what I was trying to ask earlier, to try to sort of envision yourself, three amazingly accomplished people doing really important work now. But imagine yourself as given the opportunity to come to a liberal arts college and set up your own choice of courses. Could you name 1, 2, maybe 3 classes that right now, not yourself back then, but right now, that you would really like to take and that maybe isn't or might be possibly related to what you do, but maybe not absolutely directly or obviously? What would you really like to take if you had that freedom? Because one of the reasons for this event, as far as I can tell, is for us to be able to do this for our students and to be able to think for them, how do they begin to negotiate some of the choices that they're given, and to be able to imagine themselves as accomplished as you are as they move forward out into the future.
I would take a science communication course. I think that would be a fascinating one, and it's one that I don't think is traditionally part of a lot of curricula, but I think nowadays especially it's increasingly important, especially for a lot of scientists who simply are not trained whatsoever in terms of how to communicate. And there are a lot of great science communicators, and there are a lot of not so great science communicators. And you know, some of it is just basic training, but some of it can be taught in a more cohesive way and more effective way. And I think that a liberal arts college is the perfect place to do that. And you know, there are great examples of people you could bring in to help teach that. And so personally, I guess I'm at the stage of my career where I think it's so important now to try to convey a lot of the importance of the the work that I do in the field to go beyond the laboratory and really to try to make a societal impact with this information.
So we get to design whatever courses we want. This is a fun
I was
question.
kind of hoping that you would choose things that would be available to our students. But the thing is that by doing that,
Yeah.
you might actually be planting some seeds in our senior administration's mind about what we might actually do.
It may be that you're already teaching there are two courses I want. One is very macro and one is very micro. So the macro course I want to take is on, I think we might call it whole systems change. I mean, I want to know how humans have been able to get themselves out of holes historically. Mm-hmm. And I'd really like, I'd love to have some history and some political science in that, some social movement theory. Really like, when has it happened before? And maybe it would be a study of the Great Revolutions. I'm not sure it would be. It's not my field, but that's a course I'd love to take. The other course I'd like to take is much more micro. I find if you really open yourself to what's going on in the world right now, it's very easy to get either overwhelmed, because it's easy to just spend one's time just getting distracted all the time, or full of despair, or possibly rage. And so the course I want to take is a cross between ethics, moral reasoning, and meditation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, seriously. Sure. Which is, how to think about what it means to be a completely powerless individual in a world of 9 billion people, where everything's moving so quickly. Mm-hmm. So how do you sort of hold yourself? How do you think about what it means to act in this kind of world? Mm-hmm. So I'd love that course too, please.
Wouldn't we all?
Well, I definitely want to take their class. I just have to say, like, when I went that day tidal pooling, and then they got to go snorkeling, and I walked them down to the boat launch, and then they got to go in the water and on the boat, and I'm like, bye. And they're like, aren't you going to come? And I'm like, I want to, maybe next time. And then they went to Hawaii, and I did see one of the students, and I said, how was it? And she's like, well, we actually had to do a lot of work. I was like, but what else did you do, So, I mean, I just think that class is this immersion class where they are actually working in the lab. Like artists always, we want to get out there and we want to be in the lab. We want to learn the tools and see the objects and the different devices and the technologies, because that's where I think you come up with different ways of using them. And so I would say, I really am interested in, if I was taking different types of GIS modeling classes, being able to be in the lab, but kind of also, as an artist where my project doesn't necessarily have to be as practical, or as direct, and maybe I can recontextualize it in different ways.
Thanks. And I'll go on script. Let's see. What do you think are some of the most important issues or opportunities, or both, for students today pursuing your fields?
What's the problem with scripts?
Well, I'll give you the obvious answer. I mean, there's all kinds of technologies to be invented and firms to be launched. And I'm not a big fan of saying everyone should go into business or that's the only way to make the world, but you did say in my field. And there's a ton of work to be done in food, in construction, in energy, in thinking about how we take advantage of AI so it augments existing skills and doesn't replace. I mean, there's just so much work to be done in business. And I think sometimes I meet students who are very idealistic and very passionate, and that's fabulous, but sometimes they go into NGOs, or not, which is great for the right people, but you can do a lot in the commercial sector, and there's a lot to be done.
Well, to follow up on that, I also think, before I came here today, I thought of the great potential that the business world has in terms of climate change, but now I'm really a convert after listening to your presentation. It makes no sense to think that we can just exclude this portion of the equation that has such a huge lever on all of us. And so I think that that's a big one. And I'm I don't know enough to be completely hopeful about this, but I've always held out hope that there may be some technological breakthrough coming soon down the pike, and that's largely based on just optimism. But I also think that it can be surprisingly difficult to forecast even the next decade. And here I am, someone who makes forecasts from climate models out the rest of the century. But it is humbling when you think, and this is sort of a backward example in terms of what technology could bring to bear on reducing carbon emissions, but something that happened that I'm not sure many people at all foresaw was the revolution in horizontal drilling and fracking that changed the equation dramatically in terms of coal production, oil, and now natural gas. And so 15 years ago, I don't think people saw that, and that's something that changed things dramatically. Natural gas production does emit less than coal, but it's still a fossil fuel. And so it's a reminder, at least to me, that even though it's sort of a good news, bad news, right? I mean, technology can change in ways that suddenly sometimes that we can't foresee, and there may be a huge breakthrough coming down the pike that would help transform us from into a more carbon neutral economy. But on the other hand, it can flip the opposite way too, and we don't know how that'll happen, but it's something that we should always keep in mind. It's something in terms of our forecasts that there's always wild cards out there.
I think in my field that business skills are very important for artists, and learning how to be entrepreneurial, because on the teaching circuit, there aren't that many jobs that are available, and there aren't a lot of high-paying opportunities as an artist. So any kinds of internships and real-world experience are incredibly valuable.
I think at this stage we have some time, and if there are questions from the audience, we can take those, if you guys would be willing.
As long as they're easy.
Yeah, okay. A few softballs, but we would ask, if possible, if you wanted to ask a question, we have 2 microphones set up so that we could either see if we could have someone run them to you, or you could get up and go to it yourself.
Hello, it works. For Professor Henderson, actually for all of you, thank you for your inspirational messages. It's good to hear. But on the matter of corporate behavior, as she puts it, corporate purpose, do you see that as a substitute for a price on carbon?
Absolutely not. No, I think of purpose as a lubricant and a catalyst. That if we had a group of purpose-driven firms really moving aggressively in this direction, and we do, that would increase the odds of political action. I think we need business to go to governments across the world and say, we need a price on carbon, we need a variety of other regulatory structures, but principally a price on carbon. No, purpose is, in my mind, a way of nudging us away from it's only about the quarterly profits, that's all we care about, which is a caricature, of course, but sort of supporting a focus on the longer term, supporting a focus on collective action, supporting a focus on stronger institutions. So absolutely not. No, it's not that purpose-driven firms could save the world alone. That, in fact, would be immensely dangerous. We'd put our lives in the hands of the big corporations, and I'm not recommending that. No. Yeah.
Yes, I want to thank you all again. It was a very fascinating series of presentations. And Stephen, you're a quintessential scientist as you presented your observations and what you can see, in terms of cause and effect. What I thought I was seeing was these are effects, these are effects. What wasn't as clear to me was you didn't talk much about your views on, or your models tell you about cause, which I would have thought, not necessarily that was your job today per se, but if you think about Rebecca's spectrum of, the activists and all the other end, the doubters, it'd be useful, I think, to understand what's implicit in your model as far as the causes. is it just another natural event that the Earth goes through from time to time, or does your model already take a different, what's in your model as far as the causes go? I would think that'd be important to be clear and explicit if it helps motivate businesses and energize those that need to be energized.
Sure. Yeah, not even really an assumption, but really the driving force that's producing the kind of projected climate changes we see from climate models is first and foremost the increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So you run a climate model, you put in the current increase in, say, carbon dioxide or methane, and you see the climate model shows a warming trend, and you see that the Arctic warms more than the global average and so forth. Climate modelers like me have done exercises where you remove the artificial increase in these greenhouse gases and looked at natural variability, solar cycles, volcanoes, other factors, and no matter how hard we try, we can't get a significant warming trend like the kind that have been observed. And so even though we know that there are natural cycles involved, we know of none, and the climate models aren't producing any over the short time scale of, say, the past century that would explain the warming trend. And, sunspots has been brought up, lots of different things have been brought up. Volcanoes, we know volcanoes affect the climate. We know solar variations affect the climate. But on the time scales that we're talking about, both in the past 100 years and in the next century, we have tried and we have not come up with any other explanation. Yeah, and so I do get that a lot. I mean, almost that's the first rebuttal I often get from people who don't like what I'm saying. They say, climate change is natural. We go through cycles. And that's totally true, but it's completely misleading too. The ice ages happened before humans had an impact. And I kind of liken it to saying, that argument, if you take it literally, is like saying that all cancer is natural because people have always gotten cancer, and therefore living next to a toxic waste site has no bearing on your likelihood of getting cancer, right? They're not mutually exclusive. And so the pollution that humans are producing can certainly override, in the short term at least, the natural influences that affect climate.
There's no student that wants to ask a question.
I know. Come on.
You're supposed to be exploring right now.
Come on. Yes, here we go.
Yeah. All right.
So you kind of touched on this a little bit, but a question that has often come up in my studies here at Bowdoin is, and this kind of also came up a little bit in Professor Rosenberg's talk, is kind of our views on nature and like our, I guess, relationship and role of it, whether we're part of nature or separate from nature. And so I was kind of wondering, for the three of you, and sorry, this might be one of those not easy questions, but are we part of nature, and how does that answer shape kind of the discourse and I guess actions to take in each of your respective fields and maybe interdisciplinary action?
It's a great question. Leaves us all speechless. Stephanie, do you want to start, or do you want me to? Okay, I'll be the fodder here, the first one to go. So it's a great question, and it's perfect for this kind of forum. Not an easy question to answer, clearly, but I've heard the argument that what humans are doing to, say, in terms of climate change, polluting the environment and affecting the global environment, is really just a natural, completely natural function, because we humans evolved just like other species, and for whatever reason we developed this capacity and this ability to affect our entire global environment. And so it's sort of a dismissive, very pessimistic view of things that, well, this is either inevitable or this is just natural climate change in a weird way, in the sense that humans are part of nature and humans are doing this. So, oh well. There's lots of examples from the geologic record of organisms affecting climate too, globally in big ways. So I think that that's certainly true, but I think at some point we do have to step back and say that this is self-defense, that we are needing to act in a way that, regardless of whether you take that argument literally, that there are things that we're doing that are hurting ourselves, not to mention lots of other species. And so it's in our own selfish interest to try to put a check on climate change to the point where, at the very least, we slow it down so we have more time to adapt to it, but hopefully find ways to really bring it under control if we can, in ways that will not only help the world as a whole, but will help humans and reduce a lot of suffering in the future.
Go on, Stephanie, you've gone
Oh,
last
okay.
so often. It's my turn.
Well, I would agree, I agree with what Stephen says. And yeah, I mean, I think that right, there's these differences of opinion. And, part of like this Anthropocene discourse is kind of challenging, right, this duality, right, this split. And I think that a lot of academics are, saying that, that we need to be conscientious and, that it is our responsibility, but it shouldn't be so human-centric. And I mean, I think I would just kind of have to look at it that, in what you're saying, that, if we are going to be selfish about it, that we do need to do something about it regardless. And so, if you are concerned that you do need to get out there and, partner with grassroots organizations or do certain kinds of research and to put it out there. So that's not, I would say, a very philosophical perspective on it, but more of a kind of proactive way of looking at it.
I think your question is fundamental. I'll give you an instrumental answer and a personal answer. The instrumental answer is, one way, to me, it feels, of looking at the last 100 years is we used fossil fuels to separate ourselves from nature. We could kind of bulldoze our way through without understanding natural constraints. And that to survive as a species, you see this most evidently in agriculture, we'll have to learn to work with natural systems in all their complexity and diversity. We can just build enormous walls to try and keep the sea out. We're much better off sort of working with the sea and working with natural materials. So that's an instrumental answer, is that keeping ourselves separate from nature is just a bad idea. I think personally, if you were to parse what I said, I think you would find that I didn't talk about the natural world at all in my presentation. I talked only about our own economic interests, our own psychological interests. And I've done that because I've discovered for most people are very people-focused. But if you ask me what I think is personally going on, I think that a single species is destroying the life chances of hundreds of thousands of species. And I am literally a tree hugger. I love trees. And no, I'm serious. I think they're absolutely glorious organisms, absolutely wonderful. And the fact that climate change is going to kill, I mean, pick your number, but some significant fraction of the species for so many thousands of years. I mean, it's just blows my mind, the damage we're doing. I'm sorry, that's not very scholarly. And that's actually what gets me up in the morning, is it just feels like a fundamental injustice. But I know that's just incredibly personal. That's just my particular viewpoint. But it feels to me, when we think about human, non-human, it's like, well, who are we to do that?
Yeah, just to quickly follow up on that about the time scale, I think one of the things that's hard for people to grasp about what the situation we're in now with regard to climate change is how suddenly it's happening. Because we're living it, we may not realize it, but these changes that are projected to happen by year 2100, which isn't even that far away anymore, are staggering compared to the rates of change in the geologic record. As I said, there are examples of Arctic change happening very quickly, but in general, these transformations to things like the Arctic being so warm that it was a subtropical climate in the time of dinosaurs, that didn't happen within a century. And yet we're pushing ourselves and our planet into these sorts of changes that are comparable to some of these very warm geologic periods. And I think that's an awfully hard thing for people to grasp, is how quickly that this could happen. Or a 1 meter sea level rise, which is by the year 2100, which is kind of the mainstream estimate. The devastation that would cause for cities like Miami, for New Orleans, will cause, yeah, if it happens to that degree, it is staggering. And I think that's part of the problem in coming to grips with it. It's just the suddenness of it.
But I think part of what's going on is just straight death anxiety and powerlessness. Is you think, like, it's just me, I can't do anything, and I don't want to think about anything so dreadful. That's why I think finding pathways for hope is so important here, right? Yeah.
And overcoming lethargy, which is, I think, the argument about, are we just part of the natural system, and so there we go.
Oh.
That is just lazy. So you could add that to your slide. You're idiots and lazy.
Thank you for this afternoon. It's enlightening. This question is probably more for Rebecca than anyone. What are we to make of ExxonMobil's $1 million contribution to an organization that advocates for a carbon tax? Is it totally cynical, or is it part of what you've talked about, that corporations are maybe getting on board because they see what's coming down the pipe?
Such
But
an interesting-
$1 million isn't
Yeah.
a whole lot of money for them.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and one of the reasons I think your question is so interesting is if you were to poll management experts on what was the best managed corporation in the 20th century, Exxon would almost certainly be in the top 10. Brilliantly managed organization full of super smart people. We know now, because of the lawsuit and the data that came out, that Exxon's known about the likely consequences of climate change for a long time and actively invested in reducing the likelihood of legislation, very heavy lobbying, and in active climate denial, funding all kinds of industry associations and so on. So the question is, have they changed their minds? Are they investing heavily in PR? And should we be totally cynical? So let me suggest that while it's easy to be totally cynical, as you say, $1 million in comparison to the size of Exxon, like, not so much. But should we not, I'm nervous of the NGOs who instantly dismiss it. Because we say Exxon, but Exxon's a very complicated beast. It's tens of thousands of people. And some of those people absolutely know climate change is happening, absolutely want to do something about it. And I think if we think of organizations as always kind of having an internal fight, this investment may be a very interesting walk over the line, which is, okay, we're not going to be totally obstructive, we are going to try and help, how can we best do that? And so I think it's important to keep an open mind, while at the same time absolutely trying to hold every firm to account for what it does and its trajectory over time.
Conspicuously, Exxon is not fighting the state of Washington's ballot proposal to have a carbon tax instituted. So they're one of the few energy companies in the United States that actually backed out of buying advertising to discourage voters to vote yes on that. So.
And it's interesting, that this is my first point about Exxon being, historically very well managed. It's possible that they've come to a realization like, ooh, whoops, we need to shift. And if any of the oil firms were going to really shift, it might be Exxon. I mean, Shell and BP, the Europeans are already way ahead, but in the US. Yeah.
Well, actually, BP is spearheading the campaign to prevent the state of Washington
So
from.
what's happened with BP?
Well, I mean, it's probably BP America versus BP Europe.
Yeah.
Which is to my point about multiple managers and yeah. No.
Well, I would like to thank our speakers. What an incredibly stimulating stimulating way to start our new era here at Bowdoin. And I would like to invite everybody to take 10 to 15 minutes, take a little break, get some refreshment. There's a little water and coffee outside. We'll convene back here at 3 p.m. to hear from our alumni panel. Thank you very much. This isn't on.
Well, I was thinking you guys could face. Follow the questions, and then I have some other questions to ask.
Hello, I'm preaching to the choir of those of you who are already seated, so thank you very much. We are about to begin our alumni panel, so if you haven't yet found a comfortable spot, I encourage you to find your seat so that we can devote plenty of time to hearing from these distinguished alumni. So I think that people are going to trickle in,
Okay.
and that's just a little bit inevitable, and that's okay.
I'll
So
grab
Eileen,
it.
if you want to take it away, I welcome
Sure.
you to do that.
Good afternoon. My name's Eileen Johnson, and I teach in the Environmental Studies program. And it is my privilege to convene our alumni panel. It's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists who have so graciously joined us to celebrate today's dedication of the Roux Center. And actually, before I introduce our speakers, I want to say that each of them has not only taken time from busy schedules to join us for today's panel, but have been generous in so many other ways. They have, in Kate's case, given talks on campus and mentored I don't know how many students over the years. Patrick is a guest lecturer in our environmental studies courses, and Katie has served on panels and met with our students in Washington, D.C. So thank you not only for today, but for being dedicated alumni. It's truly one of Bowdoin's strengths as an institution that we have such a committed alumni base and have been so generous in connecting with and mentoring our students. And I know in environmental studies, we definitely reap the benefits of that. Each of our panelists has worked in different dimensions of public policy and at different scales, from local to global. They work on critical aspects of energy and climate change policy in their current capacities. Because I'll be asking them to talk about their career paths, I don't want to steal their thunder, but do want to recognize where they started that journey at Bowdoin and where they are now. Kate Dempsey is a class of 1988. And received her degree in government and sociology. She's currently the state director of the main chapter of the Nature Conservancy based here in Brunswick, right down the road. Patrick Woodcock is class of 2004, and he majored in government. He is currently the Assistant Secretary of Energy for Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And Katie Auth is class of 2008, and she majored in French and history. She is currently the Acting Energy Office Director of Power Africa, a program of USAID. I've been very fortunate this semester to have had the opportunity to teach our introductory environmental studies class with my colleague, Matt Klingel, in the Roux Center.
And as you heard from Mike Colster, we have 88 students and 2 auditors. We are at maximum in the class. And that's the largest number since I've been here, starting in 2001. So I guess if you build it, they will come. But Matt and I emphasize the importance of interdisciplinarity in looking at critical environmental questions, and also emphasize the importance that all disciplines need to be at the table. We have a range of disciplines here who are at the table, and so with this in mind, I'd love to hear you talk about your individual career paths, and specifically how a liberal arts education has contributed to your journey. And Kate,
Looking at
how
me.
about you?
It's like, what an interesting question. So really briefly, because I know we're eager to talk to each other and with all of you, thank you for inviting me. Always wonderful to be here. When I think of my journey, I sum it up especially when I'm talking with students, as one that was completely unpredictable based on where I was in 1988. I was bound and determined to make a difference in cities. I was particularly passionate about affordable housing and public health. And so I became a VISTA volunteer, kind of like AmeriCorps today, and was sent in those days to Kansas City, Missouri, which was, I'll tell you, for me, a huge shock as an East Coast kid. I lived in a community was called the East of Troost, which was code for what is a white girl doing over in that neighborhood. And it was an amazing challenge and one of the best experiences I ever had in my life. And it was, as I said, a huge shock. It was more shock because I had to learn immediately, working with people from different religious backgrounds, many different backgrounds, how to be in dialogue and not prove myself that I was right all the time, and learn to listen. So I think that grew from my experience here. And then I'll just end by saying, how does that person end up leading a chapter of one of the largest conservation organizations on the planet? I thought environmentalists in 1991 didn't care about people, and who mentioned tree hugging, and that all they wanted to do was save the spotted owl. And what I have loved is that we are now in a place today where we're in dialogue together and finding solutions together that make sure that human communities are thriving and that biodiversity continues to thrive. So there was a lot in between. I teased Patrick, I said, I remember lobbying you in Senator Snow's office when you were an intern. So we've spent a lot of time together too.
I guess that's a good segue. Yeah, I had the opportunity, really on reflection, talking about the question about your Bowdoin experience and how it led to a career. I think the biggest component to raise what was being discussed on campus when I was here from 2000 to 2004 is I remember on September 11th going to Tahoe Herrera's class at 11:30. And it's hard not to convey how much there was an energy at that time to be involved in public policy, to step up in your own way. And for me, I made a list when I wanted to graduate of the things that I wanted to do. And first on the list was to work in Washington for a U.S. Maine senator. And I completed that. I have not done the AT and learned a second language, but really it was a time when everybody was looking, and in my perspective, it was really working on trying to get us less beholden to Middle East oil. And that was kind of the first start. Growing up in Maine, dependent on oil, seeing this connection to U.S. foreign policy, it seemed, if we talk about the externalities, it seemed as though that was being vividly displayed on that day, and what really sparked an interest in public policy. Moving forward, I can't thank Senator Snow enough for the experience that she gave me, and frankly, it's an education that is not provided in Washington, D.C. today. It a situation where she was not following the leader, but following her policy advisor. And that is something that is rare today. And as a result, I really needed to learn the issues, not from the Democrat leader or the Republican leader, but from both sides, and present a recommendation for what she should do on a critical vote. As a result, it really became, we were lobbied all the time by environmental groups, energy companies, and I really developed an education that was really unique. Her retirement brought me back to the state of Maine, and it was a humbling experience. And I say that because we really focus a lot on national legislation, and for good reason. But it has been refreshing to come to the state, and now I'm working for the state of Massachusetts, to see what is happening from the electrification to renewable deployment, and we'll go into see how we've changed. But really working on state policy has been, since 2012, really where climate policy and energy policy is being implemented. And I was deeply concerned when Senator Snowe announced her retirement, but in a lot of ways, it has pushed me back into where there is energy policy being implemented today that is making a difference.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so it's interesting. I was just 4 years behind Patrick, but I also, I think, have a September 11th connection in that I was in high school, and I think by the time I entered Bowdoin, we had just invaded Iraq, and I really wanted to be part of a foreign policy response that was better than that. And so I knew that's what I wanted to do ultimately in kind of a big and very nebulous way, but I had no idea how to do it. So at Bowdoin, I took a little bit of everything. I took art classes, I took econ classes, I took anthropology, and then in my junior year, I studied abroad in Senegal. And I lived in a rural area, and I experienced the effects of desertification. So as the Sahara kind of expands as a result of climate change, kind of these massive impacts on people's lives. And I kind of realized that's the space that I wanted to be active in, was climate change. But I still didn't really know how to do that. And so a couple years after Bowdoin, I ended up going to get my graduate degree in natural resource management. And I went to Iceland because I wanted to be in the Arctic and to kind of see what was going on there in one of the regions of the world where it's happening fastest and most dramatically. So I did that. And then I went to Washington, and I basically started applying to anyone who was doing anything related to climate change. And I ended up working for a small think tank that was doing clean energy development in mostly the Caribbean and in Africa. And for me, it was, I'd never done energy before. I hadn't really thought of it as a career path, but it was a really gratifying way to approach climate change in a positive light. And to say, instead of spending your career saying, no, don't do this, don't do that, you could say, we have the tools to have tremendous positive impact, and we can solve poverty and climate issues at the same time. And so that's kind of what led me into this path. And then I was lucky enough to start working for Power Africa, which is a really innovative program of the US government. And it's very tied to what Rebecca actually spoke about, in that it was launched under the Obama administration, and it was basically an acknowledgement that traditional development is not going to cut it, and public money is not sufficient to solve these issues. And it's a way to say, how can we use very targeted public sector resources to bring in private capital? All of these innovations in energy are happening. Companies have the opportunity to make a ton of money in Africa by producing clean energy solutions while solving huge developmental challenges. And so that's what we do by leveraging tools from across the entire US government.
Great, thank you. So thinking about, building on your experience and the experience that you've had professionally in the fields that you're in, what are the changes you've seen in your fields over the last decade, give or take a few years, and how did your experience at Bowdoin really prepare you to respond? And maybe I'll start with you, just kind of take it a bit out of order.
Sure, thank you. I feel privileged to have worked in energy policy over the last decade. And I juxtapose that with what I love about energy policy is the intersection of environmental requirements, technology, and public policy, and add in passion. And what we have seen in the last decade, and it was discussed previously today, is on the electric sector, if I were to bring upon in 2008 the electrification that we're at right now and the cost of batteries, the cost of solar. Massachusetts just did a procurement of offshore wind where we were hoping for prices of 12 cents per kilowatt hour. We received 6. And then add in where we are with energy efficiency and tools. We talked about tools earlier. The tools available to us have been multiplied in a way that was unimagined in 2008. And I would also, what was discussed on the natural gas proliferation for hydraulic fracturing was disrupted our entire energy markets. As we look at that, I see this region in particular, I say New York, and we work with the Maritimes and Quebec, we have tools available to us that really could be a leadership role globally in not only bringing emission reductions in the electric sector, but also doing it affordably. And that is the area that I see from an optimistic perspective. At the same time, on transportation, we've seen this incremental progress and the number of vehicle miles traveled that we're seeing is alarming. And in the same way in 2008 that I thought we saw the electric sector is making modest progress over time for declines, that is how we're thinking about the transportation emissions. We're seeing more and more people buy heavy-duty trucks, more driving, and that is the area that you're starting to see the disruption seeds begin. And if that's the one area that it's talking about students now from the TOU, we have TNCs in Massachusetts, the Lyfts, the Ubers, regulation there, how to create the right models to push technology to start addressing our public policy challenges. It really is in the transportation sector. But it has been a transformative decade, and we need a few more of those, as was stated earlier, if we're really going to address this challenge.
Great, thank you. And I just read a report this morning on the IPCC is one of the main things to do is get Americans out of their cars. So thank you. Kate, what are some of the changes you've seen?
Well, it's interesting Patrick mentioned the federal government. I'm laughing because I've had many more decades of my career, so I'm like, which part of the changes? So I think there's a couple super important changes that have been happening in the conservation movement and in the climate integration together. So first, the optimism that I feel in my daily life is stories of local action. And it can be local in Port Clyde or in the Katahdin region, or it can be local in New England or in Boston. You know, so cities taking action, communities networked together to take action, integration, as we heard, between taking action with the corporate sector, the private sector to find solutions. I think one of the challenges is how to think at the big enough scale, so system thinking, and think about what the value of a liberal arts education and the Roux Center, I mean, systems thinking embodied in a place, has to both deeply respect local communities' knowledge while making change fast enough to solve the crisis that we're in. But I try to stay optimistic because I live in a world of people making a difference, whether they're in Tanzania or they're in Port Clyde. And I believe, and the Nature Conservancy believes, that we can solve the globe's biggest problems, which are that we'll have 9 billion people on the planet. who will need clean energy, clean water, and good food. And we need everyone in this room to be able to tackle that. And so I don't care if you're a dance major or you're a government major, we've got to work together to figure this out. I think that's one of the biggest changes, is that we're understanding that. In close on this piece, I think my sector of this work, the conservation work, we have learned from our international colleagues that I think Rebecca might have mentioned, someone mentioned, who are the most vulnerable people in this world? Who will suffer from climate change are the poorest among us, women and children. And we need to figure out how to bring more people into this conversation as opposed to dividing us. So for me, that's a personal passion, is that we need to be in a values-based conversation, because it's in values that we have common ground, and fighting with each other is gonna destroy us all. So that's, you can tell I get like, this is, we gotta learn to listen and talk together in different ways.
Thank you. Katie, what are your thoughts?
I just wanted to highlight two changes. One is related to the energy sector, and then one is related to development and foreign policy. On the energy side, I think it's a really nice segue from what Patrick was describing happening in Massachusetts. What's exciting for me is, because in contrast to the US or other parts of the world, Europe, elsewhere, where energy infrastructure is already in place. So in some ways, it's harder to innovate as quickly because we have these systems that are legacy, they're baked in. In Africa, where 600 million people have no access to electricity at all, the upside to that is that there's no existing infrastructure that you have to build around, or you have to wait for it to come to the end of its life cycle. So what you're seeing is really entrepreneurial companies doing amazing things with solar and wind and renewables at prices, as the cost of solar comes down. One of the other panelists was talking about how quickly that's happened. Suddenly, I travel throughout Africa, and you're in these rural villages. There are literally, houses with thatch roofs, and people have their own solar systems. It's awesome. And it's in some ways like leaps and bounds ahead of where the US is in terms of envisioning a sector that is decentralized, that's renewables based, that's using things like microgrids. And so we still have a lot of work to do, but I see such exciting innovation happening there. The second change is something that Power Africa has been a part of, is this shift from thinking about international development and foreign assistance as something that the public sector does, and we give grants to other public entities in developing countries, shifting away from that and really focusing on how do we leverage private sector capital. And what's been gratifying to me is that just over the past 2 years, there's a lot of not great stuff happening in federal government, but one of the really great things I think that's happening is that is taking off. And Power Africa is being cited as an example of how the federal government can do a better job of being creative and partnering with the private sector to solve big problems. And I think that's the direction that USAID is going, and that's the direction that a lot of our multilateral development institutions are going. And to me, that's a much more creative and optimistic space.
Thank you. So thinking sort of forward, now that we have this amazing day of dedicating the Roux Center for the Environment, how would you draw upon your knowledge and experience, and thinking back your time here at Bowdoin, what would you do with the Roux Center? What's advice you would have for faculty, for staff, and primarily for students in terms of encouragement you would give them in terms of the spending their next 1 to 4 years here?
Oh, I have to go first.
Yeah.
I think you get that one first.
Well, I think I've already said to a couple people today, I'm just so jealous of students who are at Bowdoin now. I wish I was here. I wish I had the Roux Center. I wish I could like turn back time and come back to Bowdoin and do everything again. I guess my advice would be don't stress about what you're studying or what classes you're taking. It sounds cliche, but just go after the things that you find fascinating and trust that it's giving you the tools that you're going to use down the road to do what you want to do. A lot of people questioned, family, friends would question why I was studying French. It gave, I travel throughout Africa now. I speak French every day. And it's given me insight into how the history and the culture and the societies that I'm working with. And without that, I would not be a successful diplomat or international development agent. And I think even when you're in something that's seemingly technical, like energy, on any given day, I'm thinking about this may be the technical solution, but I'm also balancing what is the US's kind of federal interest, what is our relationship with the government of Tanzania, what is, what are the political questions here? And so I think a liberal arts education at a place like Bowdoin puts you in a place where you can juggle all of those things and see the connections. So yeah, don't stress, just take interesting classes.
I think I'd add, one, to use practical examples in assessing energy policy, environmental policy, and apply it in an academic setting. There are debates occurring that are fascinating right now that are happening in state houses, in Washington, internationally, that really could use just academic, from the undergraduate level to graduate level. I'd also say one thing that I benefited from, I did internships during the summer. My senior year, I did an internship, bringing professionalism into, as I'm reviewing resumes, just seeing people who have had work experience. And people, the Bowdoin community is here for students. People want to help people who have a real passion about these issues. So incorporating a professional development that I know the college has prioritized in public policy just recently. And then finally, bring in speakers that challenge your assumptions. I can't tell you how much I learned from trying to pass fuel economy legislation with listening to the automobile industry. And it only made my argument stronger by hearing a different perspective. And that, I think, unfortunately, is something, get yourself out of your comfort zone to improve your own beliefs, your own passions.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I would add to that, live in the world of complexity and not black and white. Black and white is wicked easy, as we say in Maine, and the world is super complex and people are complex, right? And so the more you can force yourself to live in the world of complexity and seeing the integration and connection, the more fun you'll have. Being angry is exhausting. There's good reason to be angry, but there's ways forward, I believe. For the college, nothing has been more rewarding than the partnership my organization and me personally has had with the college through the fellowship, the SIU Fellowship and the McKean Center Fellowship. And that, as cliche as that sounds, working one-on-one with the student for a summer has changed my life. To have students who have worked with us for the last, a long time, 15 years that I've been in. Those are people, whether it's Tayana Williams, who's at Yale right now, studying and working on environmental justice issues, whether it's Max, who's gone back to China and is working on hydro development and water resource questions that are really important for this world. whether, I don't know where Mariana is, but these people your students are making a huge difference already in this world. So my encouragement is those fellowships that were endowed by the Psi U fraternity. Those of us who were there at the time know what that means, but shoot, Farley Fieldhouse was built when I was talking about regrets. Like, I got 1 year of lacrosse in Farley Fieldhouse. Yeah, I would encourage us as a community to think about that critical year right after college, because what I hear from students is organizations like ours say, oh, you need 3 years experience before you can even put an application in. So the more we as a community can work together to think about how to support one-year fellowships is something I would really encourage and welcome conversation about.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I really would like to turn it, open up to the audience. We have a number of students. I know I chatted with you in the break, and encourage you to come to the microphones and ask questions of our alumni panel.
We're really not scary.
They're not scary at all, really. Hesitations? I know.
Well, we can ask each other.
Well, I have another question. If you're interested, just make yourself known, and I'll certainly cut off my conversation. But I was thinking about a conversation we're having over lunch, and this idea of hope. Teaching environmental studies is challenging at times because it gets very sobering to talk about the state of the environment. But I also feel like with great challenge comes great opportunity. And I think our students are really interested in entrepreneurial opportunities. So if you could go back in time, knowing what you know, back to the future, and you were class of 2019, where would you go next to kind of go charging out and do something entrepreneurial? And that's open to whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I mentioned it earlier. I think the disruption tools in transportation, right now I'm involved, the governor of Massachusetts created the Commission on the Future of Transportation. And to having companies come in from GM, Lyft, the model that they are talking about using to completely alter how we use our public space is eye-opening and liberating in a way that entrepreneurs, I think, have a huge opportunity to seize a transformation in our transportation sector. It's interesting when you start thinking about congestion pricing, charging Uber and Lyft higher prices during peak periods, charging them for their emissions during peak periods. The thing that's opened up that government does a good job of addressing is these new services are going to be regulated eventually. And in a way that we've had challenges of applying gas taxes to individuals for car ownership, this new model creates a new space for public policy that has opportunity for entrepreneurs and also for public policymakers.
No, I don't have a brilliant answer.
Okay. I mean, I would go work for a startup doing energy access work in some country. I think first of all, I think traveling and working outside of the US is a huge recommendation in general, especially soon after you graduate, just to give yourself, break out of the mold that you've lived in, that you've grown up in, go somewhere completely different, see a different perspective. But then for me, the exciting entrepreneurial work that's taking place, at least in places like Africa and India, is that, if we're going to figure out how to supply clean energy to the billions of people who still don't have it, the innovation that needs to happen is not really technical at this point. The technology is there, but the exciting innovation that you're seeing is really on the business model side. And so you're seeing companies figure out, like, okay, how can we get this to a price point that a rural family in Africa can afford? And they're doing it. And they're figuring out different forms of payment, and they're using mobile money on cell phones, and they're doing really cool things that's kind of enabling change much faster than you would have expected a decade ago. And so, you know, you're seeing amazing things like everyone has a cell phone, even in rural parts of Africa. So if you enable people to make payments for energy through that phone, and you give them a solar panel, suddenly not only are they paying for electricity, they're also demonstrating their credit viability. They're showing that they are a viable consumer who can pay back money, and that is opening up whole other sectors. And suddenly these people are part of the economy in a way that they haven't been before. So that's really exciting. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, just go work somewhere outside of the US.
Yeah, that was I mean, that's Kansas. When I moved to Kansas City, it felt like that for me. I mean, truly, it was like, I've gone to, people thought, why do you, they literally, it was like, who's our artist? You're an artist? They'd say, why do you wear black all the time? Are you in mourning? And I'm like, no, I'm from the East Coast. So it was really good to go in, and so a little different and spin on the question. It's come up in some of the other talks, I would challenge us to, if you're an ecological or an ocean scientist, you better start learning about behavioral science and start talking to each other, because what we know, and I think you referenced it a little earlier, is when you showed the Yale, whoever showed the Americas, the 6 Americas, those of us who spend our days talking about climate change, have turned many people off and scared the heck out of them. And what we know is that if you, again, can talk about things that we know, that ticks in Maine are in northern Maine, ticks are in northern Maine, and a lot of people really care about that. So the more those of you who are on one side can learn from the other side and start integrating, it's not exactly answering your question, but that's where the solutions are going to be, because we know from other countries, human beings change when, peer pressure. So we know people will reduce energy use because they learn that their neighbor is reducing energy use. So the more you can be in a sector that's integrating climate science and human science, behavioral science, I think you're gonna be just fine. We need all the help we can get.
Great. Just want to check to see if there's questions. Oh, great.
Patrick and I both worked. He worked in the Senate, I worked in the House. Each of us can tell you why the other was better. I'll quickly say the two most important things is to build a relationship with the staff member that you want to work with. So Patrick and I worked together for years, all kidding aside, and he and his colleagues and I built a relationship when we were working on the Penobscot River Restoration Project. If it hadn't been for that relationship, Senator Snowe, he made a huge difference and made sure that project happened, because she knew that the communities in Maine cared about that project being successful for a variety of reasons. But it was because we had built longstanding trust, not just between he and I and the senator, but between many, many other people that we represent. So trust and building relationships. Personally, as a staffer, I hate to say this, but a bazillion calls just are exhausting. I worked during the Clinton impeachment, so we didn't even have Facebook, so I can't even imagine. So I would say building relationships with your local officials is also, get back to this idea that change is happening locally, is a really important piece as well.
I'd add, Kate mentioned reasons, and unfortunately, we haven't gotten to the point where I have not seen public policy moved for the sake of climate change alone. It's been a multifaceted, whether it's to reduce oil consumption, whether it's for economic development, whether it's for growing a new offshore wind industry in Massachusetts. And it goes to the point of what is the commonality of that chart that was showed for business interest, what do we need to do, here's that colored shaded area. And bringing your voice in terms of Washington, state houses, you need to be amplified by multiple voices, because it's the common denominator that really passes things. And it's really coalition building that I've only seen coalitions pass things rather than individual voices.
Yeah, and sorry. I would just add from a slightly different angle. So if you are an advocate or someone who's approaching or thinking about how to approach the federal government, it's very easy to get caught up in what's going on at kind of the highest executive level, at the political level. That's what's most visible, that's what's most in your face every day, that's what can sometimes seem most hopeless and frustrating. But I think our system is designed to have these agencies filled with really smart, really dedicated people who play the long game. And I wouldn't give up. I wouldn't give up on the federal government. And I would recognize that you can still have extraordinary impact by getting your message in below the most senior level. The career people who work at State Department and USAID are going to be there in 4 years, in 8 years, in 10 years. And that's what's going to change how those things are done. So yeah, understanding those different levels of government and how to leverage them, I think is critical.
And then adding to what Patrick said, when you have surprising coalitions, so whether it's public health and the environment, we worked to pass major funding in the state for river restoration through working with the Associated General Contractors and making the economic case to the LePage administration and to the legislatures who had to vote it on so that it would get on the ballot. And working with the Associated General Contractors made absolute sense. It's jobs for rural Maine, and it's creating robust fisheries and healthy rivers. So for me, the more you can work to find, again, common ground with people may seem unusual partners, the better.
Great. Just want to check if another question.
Uh-oh. It's a softball question. It better be. See,
So this is something
he'll
we're
answer
obviously
that, yeah.
exploring regionally. The interesting thing with New England and Massachusetts is we have a history of jumping in the pool together on big initiatives. And at this point, it is hard for me to foresee an individual state in New England and New York unilaterally moving forward with a carbon tax. I think I could see a coalition of states exploring applying a tax level that is either combined with what Washington, California, or Quebec has. it is very interesting about, the issues that you get on in all energy policy is equity. And Maine, from an individual who still has a house in Millinocket and is traveling for a job in Bangor, or somebody in Western Mass who's traveling to Boston, how to equitably apply carbon taxes where that individual is supportive of this policy. And I think the economists a lot of people see the benefits long term. It's really making sure that this does not devolve into a competition between urban and rural. And I think that would be the detriment in any public policy debate around a carbon tax.
Yeah. One last. I'll be really quick, Eileen,
Okay.
and then we'll close with this. Look, I work for the largest conservation organization on the planet. If we can't get out of our own way to figure out how to make a big difference, we might as well just pack it in the morning. So we have to act now, we have to act fast, and there's huge opportunities to save this planet, and I believe we can do it.
I think one thing that I had the opportunity to go to Copenhagen as part of the international climate negotiations in 2009, and it was deeply depressing, not only because it was 4 hours of daylight, but the challenge that I think one problem that we have is we put too much faith in the international agreements. I do think it was hugely important what Paris accomplished. It was a mistake for the United States to pull out, but I think increasingly, you saw at the end of the Obama administration, I give them a lot of credit, they moved forward with the contours of a bilateral agreement between the US and China. And to really address this through bilateral trade ultimately is how I think you successfully, with the big economic players, is how you're going to solve this. I think if we just keep on waiting for another Paris, keep on waiting for this another international agreement, ultimately it really is going to be an agreement with the major economies to say, yes, we're going to hold each other to meeting these emission targets, and if not, then these tariffs, these trade barriers will go up.
Yeah, I mean, so working in federal government is probably the slowest moving, most bureaucratic place, other than the UN maybe. So I would say, I mean, and that has its design, right? You want, to some degree, you want a national government that is slow moving and unreactive and hard to turn around, because you don't want the craziness of whatever political moment you're in to be able to impact the country in ways that you're not intending. But I think it means on the con side that if you're expecting rapid change from the federal government, you better get a new plan. Although the thing that gives me hope is, so Rebecca mentioned in her panel, if you look at times in history, like World War I, if you look at what the US actually had before we entered the war, we had nothing. We were not prepared at all. And so I think you do have to maintain some hope that if we put our minds to it, we can do it, and the federal government can be part of that. But I think at this particular moment in time, the really exciting stuff and the fast-moving stuff is happening both at the local level and it's happening in the private sector. And government can play a really positive role in accelerating that and nudging that in the right direction and ultimately following that lead. But yeah, it can be frustrating to work in a bureaucratic tanker ship.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your comments.
I just want to add a quick thank you again to all of our speakers today, to Stephen, Rebecca, and Stephanie for their insight and their vision, for inspiring us, to Kate and Patrick and Katie for sharing your experiences and remaining such a vibrant part of the Bowdoin community throughout the years, and to all my colleagues and the students who asked such good questions. And most of all, thank you to the audience for being here to launch this new era in the study of the environment at Bowdoin. So many of you are continuing on to the dedication of the Roux Center right now, while others of you will be going to the open house tomorrow, Friday at 4:30 p.m. and the evening concert. I hope that you all take the time to explore and admire this beautiful building over the week and weekend, and to engage in conversations about the environment while you're here. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
It's kind of replenishing to come back.